I have told this story exactly 4 times in my life. Once to the tribunal, once to my mother over a bad connection, while she cried and I stared at the ceiling of a medical bay. Once to a journalist who never printed it because nobody believed her. And once, just once, to a Veth elder, in a room so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat echo off the stone walls. He wept. I did not know they could weep until that moment. And afterward he told me that what I had done was either the bravest thing a human had ever attempted or the most incomprehensibly stupid. He said he had not yet decided which. I told him it was probably both. That was 11 years ago. I am telling it now because the piece is holding, and because the young people at the academies, the new cohort, the ones who grew up after the Silence Accords, they do not know how close it came to going the other way. They look at the Veth delegates in the corridors, enormous and measured and draped in their ceremonial gray, and they see allies. They see neighbors. They do not feel, the way my generation feels, the particular cold that lives in the back of the skull when one of them turns its head too fast. I want them to understand what the price was, not to frighten them, but because they should know. My name is Sira Vasquez. In the autumn of my 2nd year at the Calder Interspecies Diplomatic Academy, I was 22 years old, studying xenolinguistic mediation, and I was sleeping badly because my roommate Priya snored and the radiator in dorm block 7 made a sound like a dying animal every time the temperature dropped below 4 degrees Celsius. That is the world I was living in when the cub found me. The Veth had been at Calder for 3 years before I arrived. They were the first non-human species to enroll in a human academic institution, a symbolic gesture, the diplomats said, a sign of thawing relations following the boundary incidents of 2061. The boundary incidents was what the official record called the 18 months of engagement along the Kepler corridor that killed 11,000 humans and an unknown number of Veth. The Veth did not share their casualty figures. They did not explain why. We had learned by then not to push. There were 6 Veth students at Calder when I started my 2nd year. They lived in a separate residential wing, not by human design but by Veth request. They were a species that required space, literal and psychological, in ways that the original architects of the dormitory program had not anticipated and scrambled to accommodate. Their quarters were reinforced. The ceilings were raised. The corridors were widened. The ventilation ran differently because Veth biochemistry produced compounds that, in high concentrations, caused headaches and mild disorientation in humans. Not dangerous, just uncomfortable. We shared classrooms. We shared the library. We shared the cafeteria, though the Veth ate at a separate counter because their nutritional requirements were specific, and frankly, because the sight of them feeding made several of my classmates visibly ill. Not from disgust, from something more primal. The Veth were predators. They had the eyes of predators. They moved with the unhurried precision of something that has never, in the long history of its species, had serious cause for fear. They were not unkind. That was the thing that confused people who had not met them. The Veth at Calder were genuinely there to learn, genuinely invested in the diplomatic project, genuinely trying in their way to build something. But there was a quality to their attention when they looked at you. A weight. The way a deep cold body of water has weight even when it is perfectly still. I had managed in my 1st year to have approximately 4 real conversations with any of them. My xenolinguistics program required 2 Veth-track seminars, and I sat in those seminars and I participated, and I was professional and courteous, and I went back to my room afterward and sat on the edge of my bed for a few minutes before I could do anything else. Not from fear, exactly. From the effort of it. From the constant low-level calibration of being near something that your nervous system had strong opinions about, and overriding those opinions, 4 hours at a time, twice a week. This is not a criticism of the Veth. This is just what it was. The cub arrived in September. I learned about it the way most of the human students did, through rumor, then through a terse announcement from the academy administration, that a juvenile Veth, the offspring of Ambassador Kale Voss and his mate, would be residing in the Veth residential wing for a period of approximately 4 months while family arrangements were finalized. The announcement asked that human students give the wing a wider berth than usual during this period, as juvenile Veth exhibited behaviors that could be startling to the unprepared. We were not told what behaviors. When Priya asked our residential advisor, she was told it was being handled. I did not think much about it after that. I had 3 papers due in October and a practical exam in Veth tonal register that I was genuinely worried about, because Veth language involved frequencies at the edge of human hearing, and my frequency discrimination had always been mediocre. I had enough to occupy my mind. The first time I heard the sound, I thought it was the radiator. It was a Thursday night, somewhere past 2 in the morning, and I was half asleep in that particular miserable liminal state where you are not resting, but you are also not quite conscious enough to decide to get up and do something about it. The radiator had been bad that week. Something was wrong with the building's heating system, and the maintenance request had been sitting unanswered for 4 days. So when I heard a low, rhythmic sound vibrating somewhere below the threshold of clear perception, I put it down to pipes and pressed my pillow over my ear and waited for it to stop. It did not stop. It changed instead. It shifted in pitch, moving in a pattern that was not mechanical, not the random arrhythmia of a failing valve, something that had shape, something that repeated, and underneath it, when I strained to listen, something else, a quality I could not name at the time, though I would spend a long time later trying to find the right word for it. The closest I ever got was this. It sounded the way a very small, very frightened child sounds when it has been crying for so long that it no longer has the energy to cry properly, and has collapsed into something quieter and more hopeless than crying. I lay there for approximately 3 minutes telling myself I was imagining it. Then I got up. The dormitory corridor was empty and dimly lit, the overnight setting that kept the lights low enough not to disturb sleeping students but bright enough to navigate by. The sound was clearer out here, still below the frequency where I could pick it out as distinct notes, but present. A pressure, a vibration that I felt as much in my chest as I heard with my ears. I followed it. I want to be clear about something. I was not being brave. I was half asleep and faintly irritated and possessed of the particular stubborn curiosity that my mother always said would either make me extraordinary or get me killed. I was not thinking about Veth biology or diplomatic protocol or what my residential handbook said about proximity to the Veth wing after hours. I was thinking about the sound and where it was coming from. The door at the end of the east corridor that connected our block to the Veth residential section was supposed to be locked. It was a heavy fire door with a keypad and a sign that reminded human students in 3 languages that access required prior authorization. It was open, not propped open, the latch had not caught. In the gap between door and frame, about 30 centimeters wide, I could see the low amber glow of the Veth wing's overnight lighting. And curled against the base of the door, on the human side, was the cub. I had not seen a juvenile Veth before. The adult Veth at Calder stood between 2 and 2.5 meters tall. They were bilaterally symmetric in the way that convergent evolution produces across many worlds, 2 primary limbs for locomotion, 2 for manipulation, a distinct head structure. But the similarities to human body plans ended there. Their skin was a dense, layered dermis in shades of dark amber and gray, somewhere between leather and bark in texture. Their faces were broad and low, with forward-facing sensory clusters that functioned roughly as eyes but were structured very differently, and mouths that were wide and had too many hinge points. They moved with a particular rolling economy of motion. Watching them walk was, if you were honest with yourself, like watching something that was very carefully choosing not to run. The cub was maybe 60 centimeters long, curled into a tight sphere the way small creatures curl when they are cold or frightened. Its dermis was lighter than an adult's pale amber, almost gold, with none of the gray banding that came with age. Its primary limbs were tucked under its body. Its sensory clusters were closed. It was, despite everything, very small. It was also making that sound. Up close, the vibration was strong enough that I felt it in my back teeth. Not painful, but insistent, the way a phone buzzing against a hard table is insistent, something that demands you attend to it. I stood there for what was probably 30 seconds, but felt much longer. Then I crouched down. I am not sure what I intended to do. I think I wanted to see if it was hurt. That is the only explanation I have ever been able to offer that satisfies me because it is honest, not calculation, not heroism. I wanted to see if something small and curled and making a sound like that was hurt. I said very quietly, "Hey." Nothing happened. I said, "Are you okay?" The sound changed, a slight rise in pitch. The cub's form shifted, not unfurling, just a small movement, a reorientation. One of the sensory clusters opened, just slightly, a thin stripe of amber light in the darkness of its face. Looking at me. I did not move. I have thought about this moment many times in the years since. What the cub perceived, I cannot say with certainty. I know what the xenobiologists told me later, that juvenile Veth in distress emit the subsonic register as an automatic biological response, the same way a human infant cries, and that the frequency is specifically calibrated to trigger response in adult Veth. That it is, in essence, a beacon, a distress call coded into the body. I know that the adult Veth, when they are within range, find it physiologically very difficult to ignore, that it produces something in them analogous to what I would call urgency, close enough to anxiety to serve the same function. I know that I am not Veth. I know that my auditory and neurological architecture is entirely different, and yet I crouched on a dormitory floor at 2 in the morning and did not leave. I have thought about why. The best I can offer is this: I recognized it, not the frequency, not the specific sound, but the thing underneath it, the thing it was expressing, and whatever part of me recognized it decided, without consulting the rest of me, that I was not going anywhere. The cub unfolded. Slowly, one limb at a time, the way something tests ground before committing weight to it. It raised its head, proportionally large for its body, the way young things often are, and oriented its sensory clusters fully toward me. It was close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from its dermis. Veth ran hot. I had read that. Knowing it as a fact and feeling it as a physical reality were not the same experience. It made a different sound. Short, low, questioning, not the distress register, something else. I said, "I don't know what you're asking me." It tilted its head. A slow, deliberate gesture that I recognized later as a Veth behavior, meaning something close to continued attention, processing, waiting. At the time, I only knew that it looked, in that moment, very much the way a dog looks when you speak to it, and it is trying very hard to understand. I sat down on the floor, cross-legged, back against the wall, facing it, at its level. I did not think about whether this was the right thing to do from a protocol perspective. I thought, small things are less frightened when you are small too. We looked at each other for a while. Then it crawled into my lap. Not quickly, nothing about the Veth was ever quick unless it chose to be, deliberately, testing, pausing halfway to look up at me again as if checking whether I was going to do something alarming. I sat very still. I kept my hands where they were, at my sides against the floor. I let it make its own decision. It settled against my stomach and tucked its head under my left arm, and the distress sound, the subsonic vibration that had been running since I woke up, went quiet. Just quiet. I sat there on the dormitory floor with an alien predator's infant curled against me, and the corridor was silent, and I breathed very carefully, and I thought, well, this is a situation. I did not sleep that night. Not from fear. I want to be clear about that, because when I have told this story, people often assume the fear must have been the dominant register. It was not, after that first minute. What I felt, sitting on that floor, was something more like the profound and slightly bewildered calm that I imagine people feel when they are holding a sleeping newborn. A sense of being entrusted with something. A sense that movement and noise, and all the ordinary business of being a person, would have to wait. The cub slept. Its breathing slowed into something deep and rhythmic. Occasionally it shifted, pressing more firmly against me, and I accommodated the shift without thinking about it. Some responses do not require thought. That is the thing about mammals, and it seems to be the thing about certain other kinds of life as well, the ones that are born helpless, that begin the world dependent, that carry in their earliest weeks the memory of being held. I was thinking by around 4 in the morning about what happened next, about what I was supposed to do, about whether I should wake someone, my residential advisor, someone from the academy administration, someone in the Veth wing, about what the protocols said, about whether there were protocols for this specific situation, because it seemed unlikely to me that anyone had sat down and written out a procedure for a human student who had found a Veth cub on the wrong side of a fire door and was now functioning as a temporary nest. I decided to wait until morning. This was not a decision based on any particular logic. It was based on the fact that the cub was asleep and I did not want to disturb it, and the only way to get help without disturbing it would be to put it down. And when I thought about putting it down, I looked at its face. The sensory clusters closed, the jaw slightly slack, the quality of its breathing, and I did not put it down. Dawn came through the narrow window at the end of the corridor in a pale gray sheet. The building began to wake around me, sounds of water through pipes, a door somewhere above, the particular creak of an old structure expanding slightly in the changing temperature. The cub stirred. Its sensory clusters opened. It looked up at me. I said, "Good morning." It made a sound I had not heard before, not the distress register, something shorter and softer, a single low note that seemed to come from somewhere deep in its chest. Then the door at the end of the corridor opened, and Ambassador Veth walked through it. I have met, in my career, a number of individuals who had what I would describe as genuine physical authority, not the performed authority of someone who has been taught to project it. The real thing, a quality of presence that reorganizes the space around it. Veth had that quality in a way I have rarely encountered before or since. He stood 2.5 meters tall and moved with an absolute economy of motion. And when he came through that door and his sensory clusters found me sitting on the floor with his offspring in my lap, the corridor became a very different place than it had been a moment before. I did not move. I want to say this was because I had calculated that movement would be the wrong response. In truth, I think my body had simply decided not to, as a precautionary measure, and had declined to consult me about it. He looked at me for a long time. Then he looked at the cub. The cub, I noticed, had not moved either, had not made any sound, had not shown any of the startled behaviors I had read about in the orientation materials. It was watching its parent with the same quality of attention it had given me in the early hours, processing, waiting. Veth lowered himself, an extraordinary thing to watch, a being that large folding itself down to the floor with complete control, until he was at my level. His face was close enough that I could see the fine texture of his dermis, the complexity of his sensory clusters, the depth of whatever was in them. He said in Standard, the Veth at Kepler all spoke Standard, had studied it for years before the diplomatic program began. How long? I said, since about 2:30. He said, you did not leave. It was not a question, I answered it anyway, no. He looked at the cub again. The cub made a sound, that same soft single note from the chest, and reached one small limb toward him. He touched it briefly with 2 fingers. Then he looked back at me. We searched for him, he said, since midnight. We did not think to look here. The door didn't catch, I said. On the fire door he must have. Yes, he paused. He has been distressed since his mother's departure. This is a difficult period. I nodded. I did not know what to say. The words that came to mind all felt either too small or too much. Veth said, he is calm. He fell asleep pretty quickly once I stopped, started again. I didn't do anything, I just sat here. Yes, he said, that is what you did. I have thought about the way he said those words more times than I can count, the particular weight in them. He was not dismissing what I had done, the opposite, I think, though it took me a long time to understand it. He was nomming it precisely. I had stayed. I had not done anything except stay, and in the calculus of his species, that was a thing with a specific name and a specific value. He did not tell me the name that day. I learned it later from the xenolinguistics texts, the Veth word that refers to the act of remaining with another being in its distress without attempting to resolve the distress, without fleeing, without performing, just remaining. The closest translation in Standard is something like witness through, to be witnessed through a difficulty. In Veth culture, this was not a small thing. In Veth culture, this was a thing you owed a debt for. I will not pretend that what followed was simple. The Academy administration was not pleased. Not with me, they were careful about that, because Veth had made certain things clear in the conversation he had with the dean that morning, and his clarity on those things meant that any displeasure directed at me would have diplomatic implications. But they were not pleased with the situation, with the procedural failures that had led to a Veth cub on the wrong side of a secure door, with the absence of a protocol for what had happened. They wrote a protocol. It was 12 pages long. It covered situations that I was fairly certain would never arise, and it did not cover several situations that probably would. This is bureaucracy, and I do not say that with contempt. I understand now, better than I did at 22, why institutions reach for documentation when confronted with the unpredictable. It is not stupidity. It is a way of managing the anxiety of not knowing what happens next. The thing that happened next was this. I was asked, through a formal request from Veth to the Academy's Interspecies Affairs Office, if I would be willing to serve as a supplementary contact for the cub during the remaining period of his residence at Kepler. The request was phrased carefully, in the language of formal Veth human diplomatic communication, which tended toward the elaborate. Stripped to its essence, it meant, would I be willing to spend time with him? I said yes. Priya, when I told her, was quiet for a moment, and then said that I was either the bravest person she had ever met or the most incomprehensibly stupid. I told her that was the second time someone had said that to me in a week, and she said that possibly the universe was trying to tell me something. His name was Veth. That is the simplified standard rendering. The actual Veth designation for a juvenile of his age and birth rank was longer and involved tonal components I still cannot reproduce accurately. But he responded to Veth, and so that is what I used. He was, in the weeks that followed, a particular kind of company. Not easy, not what I would have called comfortable in the ordinary sense. He communicated in a mixture of subsonic register, body orientation, and occasional standard words that he had been taught but was still uncertain with. He had preferences that I learned gradually. He did not like the fluorescent lighting in the main study rooms, finding it, I gathered, somewhere in the register of mildly unpleasant. He was interested in things that moved. He was interested in anything that made unexpected sounds. He was interested in me, specifically, with a focused and patient attention that I found, once I had adjusted to it, easier to be the object of than I had expected. I showed him things. This was not planned. It grew from the first afternoon when I spread my xenolinguistics materials across the floor of the visitor room they had designated for our meetings, and he came and sat beside me and reached out and touched the edge of a printed diagram with one careful limb tip. I explained the diagram. He watched my face while I explained it. The Veth read facial expressions differently than we do, through movement and heat signatures as much as through visual configuration. And I had by then stopped trying to manage what my face did and just let it do what it did, which seemed, according to a conversation I had with Kale Voss, to be entirely acceptable. He fell asleep in the visitor room once with his head on my knee, and I sat very still and finished reading the chapter I was on, and there was a Veth staff member stationed outside the door, and I found myself wondering what she saw when she looked in through the glass. This arrangement of two very different bodies, one human and one not, one studying quietly and one sleeping, and the ease with which the space between them had apparently been negotiated. I was not naive. I knew the political dimensions of what was happening. I knew that the Academy was watching, that the Interspecies Affairs Office was filing reports, that somewhere in a diplomatic infrastructure far above my pay grade, analysts were writing memos. I knew that the boundary incidents were only 2 years in the past, and that the war, the thing the official record called the boundary incidents, because calling it a war would have required different kinds of acknowledgement, had not really ended so much as paused, and that the pause was fragile and contested, and maintained by the kind of effort that rarely makes the news. I knew all of that. I also knew Vel, who was 4 months old in Veth developmental terms, which corresponded to approximately what a human child of 3 would be, in terms of where he sat in his own becoming, who startled at loud noises and pressed against me, and then, when the noise did not repeat, made the soft chest note and settled again, who had learned my name, the Veth version of it, the sound he made for it, which was not quite Sira but which I recognized unmistakably as me. The crisis, when it came from a direction I had not anticipated. In the 5th week of the arrangement, a student named Corin Marsh published a post on the Academy's internal network that was, in tone and content, precisely what you would expect from someone who had strong feelings about the presence of Veth students on campus, access to the campus network, and no one in their immediate social circle willing to tell them to stop. It called for a review of the interspecies residential program. It used language about the Veth that was not legally actionable, but was precisely calibrated to be understood by people who already thought those things, and not understood by anyone who might object. It mentioned, specifically, that a human student was spending unsupervised time with a Veth juvenile, and called this, in a phrase that made me feel briefly and precisely the way you feel when you bite down on something you did not expect in a mouthful of food, a troubling security arrangement. The post had 11 comments when the administration took it down. 14 minutes. I know the exact number because one of my classmates screenshotted it and sent it to me, and the screenshot included the timestamp. 11 comments, none of them disagreed. I want to be honest about what that felt like. I was 22, and I had spent 5 weeks sitting on floors and explaining diagrams, and letting a small alien creature use my knee as a pillow, and I had arrived, without quite noticing the journey, at something I would have called attachment, though I was careful in those weeks not to use that word. And to read those comments, to see the particular syntax of them, the way they framed Vel not as a being with a name and a developmental stage and a preference for things that made unexpected sounds, but as a category, a symbol, a risk, was a specific kind of loss. Not of safety, of something harder to name. The thing you lose when you discover that the world you thought you were helping to build is contested in ways you had understood abstractly but not felt. I went to my meeting with Vel that afternoon. I sat on the floor of the visitor room and I spread my materials out and he came and sat beside me, and I did not tell him any of it because he was not yet able to understand those categories. He pressed his head against my arm. I did not move. The next morning I received a message from Kale Voss, requesting a meeting. I went to his office in the Veth wing, which required going through 3 security checks and being escorted by a staff member, and stepping through air filtration that removed the human-specific compounds from my environment so that the Veth-specific ones would not affect me when I was inside. The office was large and spare, almost empty. Veth did not decorate in the human sense. There was a desk, low and wide. There were two surfaces that served as chairs, calibrated to different body types. He was standing when I came in, and he did not sit, and I realized after a moment that he was doing this because he was agitated and standing was how he managed it. "You saw the communication," he said. "Yes. There will be more. Probably." He moved that rolling, controlled motion to the far side of the room and back. "In my culture," he said, "when a debt is owed, it is owed not only by the individual but by the family and in certain circumstances the clan." He stopped. He oriented his sensory clusters toward me. "You are owed a debt. What was done to you in that communication, I understand that it cannot be answered directly. Your protocols do not allow for certain forms of direct answer. But I want you to know that it is known, that it has been recorded." I said, "I'm not doing this for." "I know," he said, "that is the point." We were both quiet for a moment. "There is something I need to tell you," he said, "that is not part of any official communication, that I am telling you as." He paused. In all my dealings with him, he was precise with language in a way that I admired, because I knew how much of his precision was effort, translation, the work of making oneself understood across a gap. "There are voices within my government," he said, "who do not want this program to succeed, not the diplomatic program broadly. What you are doing. They believe that proximity creates risk, that the young should not be among humans, that we should not be building this kind of." He stopped again. The word he was searching for was in Veth first and standard second. "This kind of familiarity," he said, "they believe it weakens something, some particular thing they believe we must keep." I said, "What do you believe?" He looked at me for a long time. "I believe that my son fell asleep on a dormitory floor because a human woman stayed with him in the dark." He said it without emphasis, the way you say a thing that is so clearly true that it does not require emphasis. "I believe that there is no policy or tactical calculation that tells me what to do with that." The post was the first. There were others, not on the Academy network which had tightened its moderation, but on external platforms, picked up by outlets that had found in the story of the Veth program something that fit the particular template they were looking for. The human girl and the alien cub. Some made it sentimental, some made it sinister. A few made it both, which was, in its way, the most accurate, because the truth of most things that matter is that they contain two opposed possibilities, and the question is only which one you lean toward. I was asked twice to give interviews. I declined twice. Not out of strategy. I was not, at 22, sufficiently sophisticated for strategy of that kind. I declined because I did not think I had anything to say that would survive the translation from what it actually was into the thing that other people needed it to be, and I thought the loss in that translation would be significant. I went to my meetings with Veth. I sat on the floor. I explained things. He was learning standard faster than the developmental literature suggested was typical for his age. Kepler mentioned this to me in a brief message, almost an aside, and yet not quite. I had learned enough about Veth communication by then to hear the things that were said sideways. He was telling me something about why. I thought about that for a long time. In my xenolinguistics seminar, the week before the end of term, we did a session on the theory of language acquisition in interspecies contact situations. The argument in the primary text was that language learning between species in genuine social proximity accelerated beyond predicted rates because of what the author called motivated comprehension. The need to understand a specific being, not a category, not a species, but a particular individual whose communications mattered. That the brain, presented with someone it had reason to attend to, would find ways to bridge gaps that seemed unbridgeable in the abstract. I sat in that seminar and I thought about Veth learning standard, and I thought about me, in the early weeks, learning to hear the difference between his distress register and his attention register and his chest note, which I had never been taught to hear, and which I heard now as clearly as words. I thought about motivated comprehension, about what it means to have reason to attend. Vel left at the end of November. The family arrangements had been finalized. He would return with Voss to Veth Prime, where his mother had already gone, and he would continue his development in a Veth environment, among his own kind, which was the appropriate thing, and I had never thought otherwise. I was not his parent or his guardian or his person in any formal sense. I was the human woman who had sat on a floor in the dark and not left. The goodbye was in the Veth wing, in the wide corridor outside Voss's office. There was a formality to it, a small ceremony of the kind the Veth practiced for transitions, which involved a specific arrangement of limbs and a spoken formula that I had been coached on the evening before and managed, I was told later, adequately. Voss expressed, in the formal register, what translated roughly as durable goodwill and acknowledged reciprocal obligation. I responded with the human equivalent, the words I had been given, and I said them carefully. Then the formality ended, and Vel pressed against my legs, and I crouched down, and he pressed his head against my face, and I let him. He made the chest note just once. Then Voss lifted him, and they walked toward the transport corridor, and I stood in the wide hallway of the Veth wing and watched them go. I cried on the way back to dorm block 7, not because I was sad exactly though I was, because I was 22 and something significant had happened to me and my body needed to register it. Priya was awake when I came in. She looked at my face. She did not say anything. She went and made 2 cups of bad dormitory coffee and set one in front of me and sat on her bed, and we sat in the quiet of the room for a while without talking. That was its own kind of witness through. I have thought about that too. 11 years, the peace is holding. I am not naive enough now to think that it holds because of what I did. It holds because of 10,000 things done by 10,000 people across 2 decades of difficult and exhausting and frequently heartbreaking work. Diplomats and engineers and xenolinguists and medical personnel, and a number of individuals whose names I will never know who sat in rooms together and looked at each other and chose, over and over, to stay at the table. It holds because of Voss and his colleagues, who made arguments in chambers I was never in language I could not follow, to audiences who were not moved easily and who had, not without reason, their own fears. I am part of that larger thing, and I do not overestimate my part. But I think about those 11 comments, 14 minutes. I think about how close it was in that autumn to going in the other direction. The voices in Voss's government that believed proximity was weakness. The voices in our network posts and our external platforms that believed the same, differently dressed. How thin the margin was. How many times the margin has been thin, and how much depends on what individual people do in the moment when they are the margin. What I did was not heroic. Heroism requires choice, and I am genuinely uncertain how much choice was involved. It may be that I stayed on that floor because something in me recognized the sound and something in my biology, something old and mammalian and deeply unconsidered, decided before I could deliberate that small and frightened was a thing I responded to, regardless of what form it came in. It may be that what humans have, what we carry in the oldest parts of ourselves, is not strength in the way we usually mean strength, but something more inconvenient and more durable. The tendency to attach to specific beings, to know individuals, to find, once we have sat in the dark with something and heard it breathe and felt it sleep, that the category falls away. We are not unique in this. I do not want to make the argument that we are. The Veth have their bonds, their obligations, their concept of witness through. Other species I have worked with have equivalents of their own. But we are perhaps promiscuous in it. We attach across lines that other species do not. We find our way, without quite intending to floors and low furniture and small spaces, and we stay. The young people in the corridors of the academies, the ones who see Veth delegates and feel no particular cold in the back of the skull, they are the point. They are the thing that all of it was building toward. I am glad they do not feel what I felt. I just want them to know that someone sat on a floor in the dark. And I want them to know that it mattered. Not because of the politics of it, though the politics mattered. Not because of the symbolism, though the symbolism was used. Because a small thing was frightened, and a human stayed, and something shifted in the enormous slow machinery of how two species understood each other, shifted just enough, at just the right moment. That is what I want them to carry. Not the story, the principle. When you find something small and frightened in the dark, and you have the choice, which you always have, even when it does not feel like it, stay. Just stay.